Hello, it's Wednesday, May 17th, 2017. You are listening to Inception Radio Network, voice of the fringe majority. This is Carol Carl with UFO-Headline News. Find the Omega Centauri Star Cluster tonight. Yes, you can. Tonight or any night, in fact, in the coming weeks, let the sparkling blue-white star Spica and the very bright planet Jupiter act as your guide to the Omega Centauri globular star cluster. You can see this cluster with the unaided eye if your sky is dark enough. Omega Centauri looks like a fairly faint and possibly fuzzy star. The team at earthsky.org consider it a beautiful and very special star cluster. And in any year, the star Spica can help you find it. This year, Jupiter is also a guide for this. To find Omega Centauri, first find Spica. It'll be the brightest star in the constellation Virgo the Maiden. Oh, how do you find it? Well, we're going to be posting a chart later provided by earthsky.org, a handy-dandy consultation method. It'll show you how to do just that. Spica transits, climbs to its highest point in the sky about 10 p.m. local standard time, about 11 p.m. if you're using daylight saving time, in mid-May, all locations around the globe. We can find Spica's precise transit time for our own skies using the United States Naval Observatory chart. There'll also be a link to that. As seen from the northern hemisphere, Spica and Omega Centauri transit due south at the same time, which means that when Spica is highest in the south, Omega Centauri is too. Look for Omega Centauri about 35 degrees directly below Spica. A fist at arm's length approximates 10 degrees, so that's a guide. Omega Centauri is special in part because you can see it with your eye alone. That is, assuming you've got that dark enough sky. Very few of the Milky Way galaxy's 250 or so globular star clusters are visible without optics. What are globular clusters, you say? Well, here's the answer to that. Large, symmetrically shaped groupings of stars, fairly evenly distributed around the core of our Milky Way galaxy. Omega Centauri is the largest globular and finest globular star cluster visible to the eye alone. All of you gentle listeners living south of 35 degrees north latitude have a realistic chance of spotting Omega Centauri, though it's been seen as far north as Point Pelee, Canada. That's 42 degrees north latitude. Best appreciated with a telescope, Omega Centauri is the largest and brightest of all globular star clusters. Bottom line, use the star Spica in the constellation Virgo to locate Omega Centauri in springtime. Well, that's downright poetic. Here's an update from GeekWire. Byline for Alan Boyle. Here's the headline. SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket sends Inmarsat Telecom satellite to high-flying orbit. We should toss in, we almost missed this story. Apparently it was so high-flying it was... Well, here it is anyway. SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on Monday launched the Inmarsat-5 F4 telecommunications satellite to a geostationary transfer orbit ranging beyond 22,000 miles in height, so high that there was no chance to bring that first-stage booster back for a landing. The rocket lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center at the beginning of the launch window, 7:21 p.m. Eastern Time. That was 4:21 p.m. Pacific. Over the past year, SpaceX has made Falcon 9 booster landings seem almost routine. But missions aimed at putting satellites in geostationary orbits typically require so much oomph, there's not enough fuel for a controlled descent. Instead, the first stage tumbled back down to crash harmlessly into the Atlantic Ocean. SpaceX didn't even bother to install landing legs on the rocket. Meanwhile, the Falcon 9's second stage continued skyward to power Inmarsat's 6.7-ton bus-sized spacecraft into a successful low Earth parking orbit. A later engine burn successfully put that Inmarsat-5 F4 into its proper orbit for spacecraft separation. The Boeing-built satellite is the fourth of its breed, beefing up Inmarsat's Global Express, that's uppercase Express, broadband data network. servicing customers on land, at sea, and in the air. The 3 earlier satellites in the $1.6 billion constellation were launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan by Russian rockets. When the 3rd satellite was launched in 2015, Inmarsat CEO Rupert Pearce said his company was switching to SpaceX because of the, quote, unacceptably high failure rate, end quotes, of Russia's Proton rockets. Incidentally, Inmarsat started out as an international maritime satellite service provider, but the London-based company has branched out into fields ranging from in-flight Wi-Fi to connected cars. Coming back down to Earth, let's hover over Metehan, Nova Scotia, Canada. We had to look that up. It's spelled Meteghan. The case number is 83637, MUFON-wise. The event date is the 10th of May this year. It wasn't reported till the next day. Here's the summary. 2 objects, same shape. No visible emission on a cloudless evening. Disappeared, reappeared in different place. In the category of sighting specifics, our witness provides a viewing distance of 501 feet to 1 mile. The altitude was over 500 feet, no cloud cover. The sighting duration here was 15 minutes, but no object features are reported. The flight path, stationary, and other. And the object was shaped like something that is reported, but not that frequently, shaped like a dumbbell. How about a little look at Nova Scotia meteorology at the time of this occurrence? The maximum temperature was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Minimum temperature 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. There isn't any listing for any of the visibility factors, but the conditions indicate nothing abnormal about the weather. Here's the account, first person. I was driving towards Yarmouth from Church Point yesterday evening when I spotted one dumbbell cigar-shaped object hovering in the southern sky. At first I thought it could be a plane. The sun was setting. It would make sense that it could reflect that strongly. But then I noticed there was no emission, 0, coming from the craft. I called my husband and told him what I was seeing when a second object appeared out of nowhere. As I turned a corner on the highway, they disappeared from view. I was bummed. And then 5 minutes later, they reappeared in the same general direction. A few minutes later, one disappeared, then both. And then 3 minutes after that, another appeared, this time towards the western sky. It floated slowly across the horizon and then disappeared. The object was significantly larger than a standard jetliner, the ones I normally see in Nova Scotia skies. Nova Scotia is one of the busiest flight paths from international flights reaching United States and Canada destinations. Now, the outline of this object was fuzzy, and the objects themselves were glaringly bright. The shape of the object was cigar-shaped, but with indents in it from each respective edge, similar to a dumbbell. I felt excited when I saw these objects, excited enough to call my husband and tell him what I was seeing. And then I said out loud, "Hey, I see you. I wonder where you're from." I lost sight of these objects eventually. I took my eyes off of them as I continued my drive to town. Very cool, that inspiration our witness had to actually attempt a conversation, to say, "Hey, I see you." Now, as they say, to grease the wheels of the machinery to come, here's a Way Back Wednesday sighting. Well, not the feature story. It's a UFO stalker sighting from 1971. It took place on the 1st of June, but it wasn't reported by anybody until the 4th of May this year. The setting for this sighting is Bradenton, Florida, quite close to a recent Florida flap, by the way. The sighting specifics include a viewing distance of 101 to 500 feet, a treetop altitude. The sighting duration here was only 30 seconds. Understandably, the object features are reported as none. The flight path, straight line path, path with directional change, and other. And this object was shaped like a sphere. It had been hot that day. The maximum temperature was 94 degrees Fahrenheit, 34 degrees Celsius, down to a minimum temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Nothing to indicate any visibility factor, but there was nothing abnormal about Bradenton, Florida's weather. Here's the event. Gulf Coast off Bradenton, Florida. I was out in the Gulf swimming, about 100 yards from the shore. The tree line was right on the beach. The beach wasn't very wide. Clear, sunny day. The water was flat, and there weren't that many people around. I looked back to the shore and saw 3 gold balls in the sky over the tree line. No real idea of their size, but they weren't tiny at all. They were shiny, not glowing with light, more like a gold Christmas tree ball. The 3 balls were darting around back and forth, up and down for maybe 20 seconds. I watched them with wonder. And then, as one, they came together and formed a slightly bigger gold ball, which then zoomed up at a sharp angle and was gone. This is the first time I have told this officially. Not much, but I know what I saw, and I feel really lucky to have seen it. What are the chances? Just out for a swim in the Gulf. Cool. Ah, yes, the musical cue. Underscoring for Way Back Wednesday. Today we're going to be talking about HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, and its possible connection to Project Westford. So buckle up, and here we go. The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, that's better known as HAARP, it's an ionospheric research program jointly funded by the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, along with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, what we call DARPA. It was built by BAE Advanced Technologies. Its purpose was to analyze the ionosphere and investigate the potential for developing ionospheric enhancement technology for radio communications and surveillance. The HAARP program operated a major subarctic facility named the HAARP Research Station on an Air Force-owned site near Gacona, Alaska. The most prominent instrument at the HAARP station is the Ionospheric Research Instrument, better known as the IRI. It's a high-powered radio frequency transmitter facility operating in the high-frequency band. The IRI is used to temporarily excite a limited area of the ionosphere. Other instruments such as a VHF and UHF radar, a flux gate magnometer, a digisonde, that's an ionospheric sounding device, and an induction magnetometer were used to study the physical processes that occur in that excited region. Work on the HAARP station began in 1993. The current working IRI was completed in 2007. As of 2008, HAARP had incurred around $250 million in tax-funded construction and operating costs. It reportedly was shut down temporarily May 2013, awaiting a change of contractors. And then in May 2014, it was announced that the HAARP program would be permanently shut down later in the year. Ownership of that facility and its equipment was then transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks mid-August 2015. It's not unlikely that many of you gentle listeners are well aware of HAARP being the target of conspiracy theorists. They claim it's capable of weaponizing weather. Commentators and scientists say that advocates of this theory are uninformed, as claims made fall well outside the abilities of that facility, if not out of the scope of natural science. One of the most popular names associated with this meme is Nick Begich, Jr., the son of the late United States Representative Nick Begich and the brother of former United States Senator Mark Begich. Nick is the author of a book entitled Angels Don't Play This HAARP. He has claimed that HAARP could trigger earthquakes and turn the upper atmosphere into a giant lens so that, quote, the sky would literally appear to burn, end quotes. He maintains a website that claims HAARP is also a mind control device. And now, gentle listeners, here's the part where we sort of suggest there's a connection between HAARP and those satellite radio communications in particular, and something called Project Westford. Here we go. This information comes from a website with a very interesting name. It's called damninteresting.com. At the height of the Cold War in the late 1950s, all international communications were either sent through undersea cables or bounced off of the natural ionosphere. The United States military was concerned that the Soviets or other hostile actors might cut those cables, forcing the unpredictable ionosphere to be the only means of communication with overseas forces. The space age had just begun, and the communication satellites we rely on today existed only in the sketches of futurists. Nevertheless, the United States military looked to space to help solve their communications weakness. Their solution? Create an artificial ionosphere. In May 1963, the United States Air Force launched 480 million tiny copper needles that briefly created a ring encircling the entire globe. They called it Project Westford. The engineers behind the project hoped it would serve as a prototype for more permanent rings that would forever guarantee their ability to communicate across the globe. The project itself was a virtually unqualified success. During the summer of 1963, Earth looked a tiny bit like Saturn. That was the same year that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched on Washington, and the same year that Beatlemania was born. The United States that year also launched 500 million whisker-thin copper wires into orbit in an attempt to install a ring around the Earth. Project Westford, and it's a perfect, if odd, example of the Cold War paranoia, the military mentality at work in America's early space program. The Air Force and the Department of Defense envisioned the Westford ring as the largest radio antenna in human history. Its goal was to protect the nation's long-range communications in the event of an attack from the increasingly belligerent Soviet Union. During the late 1950s, long-range communications relied on those undersea cables or over-the-horizon radio. These were robust, but not invulnerable. Should the Soviets have attacked an undersea telephone or telegraph cable, America would only have been able to rely on radio broadcasts to communicate overseas. But the fidelity of the ionosphere, that layer of the atmosphere that makes most long-range radio broadcasts possible, is at the mercy of the sun. It's routinely disrupted by solar storms. At this point, the United States military had identified a problem. A potential solution was born in 1958 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Lincoln Labs, a research station on Hanscom Air Force Base north of Boston. Project Needles, as it was originally known, was Walter E. Morrow's idea. Walter E. Morrow suggested that if Earth possessed a permanent radio reflector in the form of an orbiting ring of copper threads, America's long-range communications would be immune from solar disturbances and out of reach of nefarious Soviet plots. Each copper wire was about 1.8 centimeters in length. This was half of the wavelength of the 8 gigahertz transmission signal beamed from Earth. That effectively turned each filament into what's known as a dipole antenna. Those antennas would boost long-range radio broadcasts without depending on that fickle ionosphere. Today, it's hard to imagine a time where filling space with millions of tiny metal projectiles was considered a good idea. But Westford was spawned back before men had set foot in space, when generals were in charge of NASA's rockets, and most satellites and spacecraft hadn't flown beyond the drafting table. The agency operated under a, quote, big sky theory, end quotes. Surely space is so big, the risks of anything crashing into that stray bit of space junk were minuscule compared to the threat of communism. The project got renamed Westford, 2 words, for the neighboring town of Westford, which is 1 word, in Massachusetts. It wasn't the first or even the strangest plan to build a global radio reflector. In 1945, science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke suggested that Germany's V-2 rocket arsenal could be repurposed to deploy an array of antennas into geostationary orbit around the Earth. So prescient was Arthur C. Clarke's vision Today's communication satellites residing at these fixed points above the planet are said to reside in Clark orbit. Meanwhile, American scientists had been attempting to use our own moon as a communications relay, a feat that would finally be accomplished with 1946's Project Diana. An even more audacious scheme was hatched in the early 60s from a shiny mylar egg that was called Project Echo. It utilized a pair of microwave reflectors in the form of spaceborne metallic balloons. As Project Westford progressed through development, radio astronomers raised alarm at the ill effects this cloud of metal could have on their ability to survey the stars. Concerns were beginning to arise about the problem of space junk. But beneath these worries was an undercurrent of frustration that a space mission under the banner of national security was not subject to the same transparency as public efforts. The Space Science Board of the National Academy of Sciences convened in a series of classified discussions to address astronomers' worries, and President Kennedy attempted a compromise in 1961. The White House ensured Westford's needles would be placed in low orbit, the wires would likely re-enter Earth's atmosphere within 2 years, and no further tests would be conducted until the results of the first were fully evaluated. This partially appeased the international astronomy community, but still, no one could guarantee precisely what would happen to 20 kilograms of copper wire dispersed into orbit. On October 21, 1961, NASA launched the first batch of Westford dipoles into space. A day later, this first payload had failed to deploy from the spacecraft, and its ultimate fate was never completely determined. Here's a Soviet newspaper Pravda headline, quote, USA dirties space, end quotes. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was forced to make a statement before the United Nations, declaring that the United States would consult more closely with international scientists before attempting another launch. And there was another launch. May 9th, 1963, a second Westford launch successfully dispersed its spindly cargo approximately 3,500 kilometers above Earth, along with an orbit that crossed the North and South Pole. Voice transmissions were successfully relayed between California and Massachusetts, and the technical aspects of the experiment were declared a success. And then that paper, the Harvard Crimson, May 24th that year, quoted British radio astronomer Sir Bernard Lovell as saying, "The damage lies not with this experiment alone, but with the attitude of minds which makes it possible without international agreement and safeguards." End quotes. So ultimately, how did Project Westford work out? And those needles? Well, we wandered over to orbital debris, jsc.nasa.gov, and found this. Westford needles. Where are they now? 50 years ago, the United States attempted to recreate a short-lived band of hundreds of millions of tiny wires around the Earth to test passive communications techniques. Ultimately, communications satellites quickly obviated the need for such concepts, but some remnants of the two test missions remain today. Under that name, Project Westford, two Atlas Agena launch vehicles, one on October 21, 1961, and one on May 9, 1963, carried special canisters of densely packed, very thin wires to act as dipole reflectors for X-band transmissions. The first mission reached its intended orbit of approximately 3,500 kilometers by 3,750 kilometers, inclination 95.9 degrees, but due to design characteristics and unanticipated thermal effects, the dipoles did not dispense individually. Eventually, only 7 small debris, which are believed to be associated with the experiment, were ever cataloged by the United States Space Surveillance Network. All are still in orbit. The second Project Westford mission was partially successful. It released an estimated 120 to 215 million copper wires, aka needles. Since 1966, the United States Space Surveillance Network has only found and cataloged 144 small objects associated with the second Project Westford experiment. There were 2 additional objects called Westford needles. They're being assessed and will be cataloged. A post-mission investigation concluded that only 25 to 45% of the planned 480 million dipoles dispersed properly. The others were believed to have remained in clumps, later discovered by the SSN. Although still strongly affected by solar radiation pressure, these clumps did not decay as rapidly as the individual needles. Today, 46 clumps remain in Earth orbit. Only 9 of those clumps are currently in orbit, with perigees below 2,000 kilometers. Data collected during observations in the mid-1990s suggest that a moderate population of small debris still resides in orbits above 2,500 kilometers. It's been suggested that these debris represent small clumps of those Project Westford needles. The legacy of Project Westford can still be found in international policies, including the first major United Nations Accord on Activities in Outer Space that calls for international consultations before undertaking any experiment which might cause, quote, potentially harmful interference with activities of other state parties in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. So say we all. We all say thanks, by the way, to our man in the high castle for providing this wonderful idea. It was a concept this broadcaster was completely unfamiliar with. So we hope it's triggered some concerns, some thoughts, some investigations. That's the thing. It's listen, learn, and remember. Oh, we just remembered we've got to go because that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to Inception Radio Network. Follow today's broadcast at ufo-headline-news.com. Take care of each other. Loving kindness. We're all in this together. This is Carol Carl. See you tomorrow.